The first thing my parents saw that morning wasn't me. It was a row of freshly painted sold signs stretching down the entire block they'd lived on for 30 years. Each one stamped with the same small company name they'd never heard before. My name is Emily Carter, I'm 28 years old, and 10 years ago on the night I turned 18, my father looked me straight in the eye in front of 20 relatives and said, "You're not my daughter anymore. Pack your things and leave." It was my birthday dinner, the kind with a long oak table, polished silverware, and my mother's expensive china that we were never allowed to touch unless guests were over. My sister Sophia sat to his right, perfectly dressed, perfectly composed, like she'd been waiting for this moment. I remember the exact weight of the room, how the air felt too thick to breathe, how every fork stopped midair, how no one said a word to defend me. I thought it was a joke at first, something harsh but temporary, the way my dad used to teach lessons. But then he stood up, walked to the front door, opened it and said it again, slower this time, like he wanted every syllable to land. "Leave. And don't come back." My mother didn't cry. She didn't argue. She just stared at her wine glass like she'd already made peace with losing me. Sophia didn't look surprised either. She just leaned back in her chair, arms folded, watching me like this was the outcome she'd calculated weeks ago. I had 1 hour. That's all he gave me. 1 hour to pack everything I owned into a single suitcase, while the rest of my family continued eating dessert downstairs. I remember zipping that suitcase with shaking hands, trying to decide what mattered enough to take with me, realizing halfway through that nothing in that house had ever really belonged to me anyway. When I walked back down the stairs, no one looked up. Not my dad, not my mom, not even Sophia. It was like I'd already disappeared. I stood there for a second longer than I should have, waiting for someone, anyone, to say something that would make me stay. No one did. So I left. That night, I slept in my car in a grocery store parking lot on the edge of town, staring at the cracked ceiling fabric and replaying every second of that dinner in my head, trying to figure out what I'd done wrong. But the truth is, this didn't start that night. It started years earlier, in smaller moments no one else noticed. The missed birthdays, the backhanded comments, the way Sophia always got first choice, first praise, first everything. I just didn't realize yet how carefully all of it had been building to that one sentence. Don't come back. I didn't realize that getting thrown out wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of something my family would never see coming. And I definitely didn't realize that one day, I'd come back to that same street, not as the daughter they erased, but as the person who owned every single house on it. But what they didn't know was that the night they closed that door on me was the exact moment everything started to change. I had exactly $83 in my checking account, a half tank of gas, and a phone that stopped lighting up the moment my father said those words. By midnight, they had already done it. They cut me off. They removed me from the family bank account. They canceled my credit card. They changed the Wi-Fi password. By morning, my number was blocked. I tried calling anyway. It went straight to voicemail every time. I sent a message to my mom, just one line, asking if we could talk. No response. I sent another to my dad, explaining that there had to be some misunderstanding, that whatever Sophia had said was not true. Still nothing. Then I texted Sophia. She replied within seconds. "I told you to stay in your place." That was it. No explanation. No denial. Just confirmation that this was exactly what she wanted. I sat in that parking lot for hours watching people come and go with grocery bags, coffee cups, normal lives that still made sense, while mine felt like it had been erased overnight. Around 6 in the morning, a delivery truck pulled in and parked 2 spots over. The driver got out, glanced at me, then at my car, then back at me again. I realized I could not stay there forever. I needed a plan, even if it was a bad one. So I opened my phone and started searching for the cheapest places to stay within 50 miles. Everything was too expensive. Even the worst motels wanted more than I had. I ended up driving 32 miles to a place just off the highway, a faded sign that flickered between 2 letters, charging $49 a night in cash. I paid for 1 night. The room smelled like old carpet and cleaning chemicals. The air conditioner rattled every time it turned on. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my suitcase, trying to understand how my entire life had been reduced to that one bag. I checked my email, hoping for something, anything from my parents. Instead, I found a notification from the bank confirming that my name had been removed from all shared accounts. It was official. I was on my own. That afternoon, I went back into my messages and read Sophia's text again. Stay in your place. I did not realize it at the time, but that sentence stayed with me longer than anything my father said, because it made something clear. This was not a mistake. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a decision, coordinated one. And for the first time in my life, I stopped trying to fix it. Instead, I started asking a different question. If I no longer had a place in that family, then what kind of place could I build for myself? I opened my laptop, the same one I used for school, and started looking for jobs. Anything. Grocery stores, gas stations, overnight shifts, cleaning crews. By the end of the day, I had applied to 12 places. By the end of the week, I was working 2 of them. One during the day at a small diner off Route 9, pouring coffee and clearing tables, and another at night stocking shelves at a 24-hour pharmacy. I slept in 4-hour blocks, ate whatever was cheapest, and kept every receipt in a small envelope because I needed to know exactly where every dollar was going. It was not a life anyone would envy, but it was mine. And slowly something started to shift. Not outside, not yet, but inside. Because every hour I worked, every dollar I saved, every decision I made without asking for permission, I was building something my family had never given me before. Control. But what I did not realize then was that those long nights, those small paychecks, and that envelope full of receipts were laying the foundation for something much bigger than survival. The first real break I caught did not look like a break at all. It looked like a mistake that nobody else wanted. A small handwritten sign taped to the window of a laundromat 3 blocks from the diner that said, "Help needed, ask for Mr. Lawson." And I almost walked past it because I was already working 2 jobs and barely sleeping, but something about the way the letters were uneven, like someone older had written them by hand instead of printing them, made me stop and go inside. The place was quiet, just the low hum of machines and the faint smell of detergent, and behind the counter was a man in his late 60s wearing a flannel shirt and reading a newspaper like he had nowhere else to be. He looked up at me once, then folded the paper carefully and said, "You here for the sign?" I said yes, even though I was not sure I should be adding anything else to my schedule. He asked me 2 questions, not about experience, not about references, just can you show up on time? And do you quit when things get hard? I answered both without thinking, and he nodded like that was all he needed. He offered me $10 an hour, cash at the end of every shift, early mornings before the place opened to clean machines, restock supplies, and keep an eye on things while he handled the books in the back office. It was not glamorous. It was not easy, but it was steady. So I said yes. That is how I ended up working 3 jobs, sleeping even less, and spending most of my time either moving or thinking about how to keep moving. The first week there, I noticed something no one else seemed to pay attention to. The machines that broke down were always the same ones, the older units in the back row, the ones customers avoided unless they had no other choice. Mr. Lawson would call someone to fix them, pay a few $100s, and a week later the same machine would be out again. I did not say anything at first. It was not my place. But one morning while wiping down the control panels, I opened the back of one of the broken units out of curiosity and saw a loose connection that looked simple enough to tighten. I had watched enough videos online during my short breaks trying to teach myself anything useful that I understood at least the basics. So I fixed it. It took 5 minutes. When Mr. Lawson came out and saw the machine running, he stopped and stared at it like he did not quite believe it. Then he looked at me and asked what I did. I told him. He did not say thank you. He did not praise me. He just nodded slowly and said, "Show me." From that day on, he started letting me sit in the back office during the slow hours, showing me how he tracked expenses, how he calculated profit margins, how he decided when to repair something and when to replace it. It was the first time anyone had ever explained money to me like it was something I could understand, not something reserved for people like my father or my sister. Weeks turned into months and I started noticing patterns not just in the machines but in the business itself. Which days were busiest? Which customers came back regularly? Which costs could be reduced and which ones were worth paying? It was small, almost invisible progress, but it was real. And one afternoon while we were going over the numbers, Mr. Lawson leaned back in his chair and said something that stuck with me longer than anything else he ever taught me. He said, "Most people think ownership starts when you buy something. It does not. It starts the moment you understand how it works. I did not fully understand what he meant then, but I would. Because without realizing it, I was no longer just working to survive. I was learning how to build. And what I did not realize yet was that this small laundromat, with its broken machines and handwritten sign, was about to change the direction of my entire life. I started keeping a second envelope about 3 months into working at the laundromat, separate from the one I use for daily expenses, and I labeled it in black marker with one word. Leverage. Even though at the time I did not fully understand what that meant, I just knew it felt different from saving. It felt intentional. Every extra dollar I could hold on to went into that envelope. Cash from the diner tips, a few dollars shaved off grocery runs, even coins I found in the laundry machines that no one claimed. It was slow, almost painfully slow, but it was consistent, and consistency was something my old life had never required from me. Mr. Lawson noticed it before I ever mentioned it. One morning while we were reviewing the weekly numbers, he saw me count the bills twice before putting them away and asked what I was doing. I told him I was trying to save enough to not have to worry about rent every month. He nodded, then asked me a question that caught me off guard. Do you want to stop worrying? Or do you want to stop depending? I did not answer right away because no one had ever framed it like that before. He leaned back in his chair and tapped the ledger with his pen. There is a difference, he said. Saving keeps you afloat. Ownership changes the water. That was the first time I heard him use that word in a way that felt real. Ownership. Not as something distant or impossible, but as something built step by step. Over the next few weeks, he started showing me more than just the numbers. He pulled out old paperwork, invoices from years ago, maintenance logs, even the original purchase agreement for the laundromat. It was not a big business. It never had been. But it was stable, predictable, and more importantly, it produced something every single month after expenses were paid. Not a lot, but enough. One afternoon, he circled a number at the bottom of the page and slid it toward me. That, he said, is what is left after everything else. It was not impressive by the standards I grew up around, but it was consistent. And consistency, I was starting to learn, was more powerful than anything flashy. I began to see things differently after that. The diner was not just a job, it was a stream of income. The pharmacy was not just overnight work, it was another stream. The laundromat was not just a place to earn hourly pay, it was a system that generated money whether someone was physically there or not. That idea stayed with me. Systems. Not just effort. Not just time. Systems that worked even when you were not watching them. Around that same time, I found a small notebook at a thrift store for $2, and I started writing everything down. Every dollar I earned. Every dollar I spent. Every pattern I noticed. Which shifts made more tips. Which products sold faster. Which days the laundromat had the highest traffic. It became a habit, almost like a second language I was teaching myself. Numbers instead of assumptions. Patterns instead of guesses. And slowly something else started to form. Not just survival. Not just stability. But a plan. It was not fully clear yet. It did not have a name or a timeline. But it had direction. Because for the first time since I left that house, I was not reacting to what had been taken from me. I was building something they could not take. And what I did not realize then was that the envelope labeled leverage, the notebook filled with numbers, and the quiet lessons in that back office were not just helping me get by. They were preparing me for an opportunity that was about to appear when I least expected it. The opportunity did not arrive with an announcement or a clear sign that this was the moment everything would change. It came quietly, almost like every other small detail I had trained myself to notice, buried inside a conversation that most people would have ignored. It was a Tuesday morning, just after 6. The laundromat had not opened yet, and I was wiping down the same back row of machines that used to break every week when Mr. Lawson walked in holding a folded piece of paper that looked older than everything else in that room. He did not say anything at first, he just placed it on the counter and tapped it twice. "Read that," he said. It was a notice. A property tax delinquency notice for the building next door. A small, run-down storefront that had been empty for as long as I had been working there. The numbers were not huge, not by any big standard, but to someone who had fallen behind, they were enough to cause a problem. I read it twice, then looked at him, not fully understanding why he was showing me this. He watched my reaction carefully, then asked, "What happens when someone cannot pay this?" I hesitated, then answered slowly, "The city can take the property." He nodded once. And then, I thought about it, going through everything I had been learning, every pattern, every note in my notebook. "Then it goes up for auction," I said. He did not smile, but I could tell I had reached the answer he wanted. "Good," he said. "Now ask the next question." I looked back down at the paper, my mind starting to connect something that felt just out of reach. "Who buys it?" I asked. He leaned against the counter, arms folded. "People who understand value before everyone else does." That was the moment something shifted. Not outside, not visibly, but inside the way I processed everything. I stopped seeing that empty building as just another abandoned space. I started seeing it as a possibility. That afternoon, after my shift at the diner, I went to the county website on one of the public computers at the library and searched for tax lien auctions. It took me over an hour just to understand the basics, the process, the requirements, the risks. Most people would have stopped there. It was complicated, unfamiliar, and honestly intimidating. But I did not stop. I kept reading. I kept taking notes. I kept connecting it back to everything Mr. Lawson had been teaching me. Systems. Patterns. Ownership. Over the next few weeks, I tracked every listing I could find. Properties that had been ignored. Buildings that needed work. Places no one else seemed interested in. And for the first time, I saw a path that did not depend on permission, approval, or being chosen. It depended on understanding and timing. One night, after finishing my shift at the pharmacy, I sat in my car with my notebook open and counted the money in my envelope labeled leverage. It was not a lot. Not even close to what I thought I would need. But it was something. And more importantly, it was growing. Slowly but consistently. I thought about the building next door. I thought about the notice. I thought about what would happen if no one else stepped in. And then I asked myself a question I had never been bold enough to ask before. What if I could be the one who bought it? The idea felt almost impossible. But it also felt real enough that I could not ignore it. The next morning, I asked Mr. Lawson what it would take. He listened without interrupting, then walked to the back office and came back with a small stack of papers. "If you are serious," he said, "you need to understand the risk as much as the reward." He placed the papers in front of me. Repair estimates, past utility costs, basic financial projections. It was not encouragement in the way most people think of it. It was something better. It was clarity. And as I stood there looking at those numbers, I realized this was the first real opportunity one had ever been given to change my position, not just survive it. But what I did not realize then was that this one decision, this one small property that no one else wanted, would become the first piece of something much larger than I could see at the time. The first time I seriously considered placing a bid, I did not feel confident. I felt unqualified, underprepared, and completely out of place, like I was stepping into a room where everyone else already knew the rules except me, but I showed up anyway. The auction was held in a small government office building about 20 minutes from the laundromat, a plain room with folding chairs, fluorescent lighting, and a handful of people who all looked like they had done this many times before. They did not talk much. They did not look around nervously the way I did. They sat quietly, holding folders, calculators, and a kind of calm that only comes from experience. I sat in the back row, clutching my notebook like it was the only thing grounding me there. The property I had been tracking was third on the list. When they called the first one, I watched carefully not just what happened but how it happened. The pace. The language. The way bids were placed without hesitation. Numbers moved quickly, faster than I expected, and within minutes the first property was gone. The second one went even faster. By the time they announced the third property, my hands were already cold. I knew the number I had written down. I knew my limit. I had calculated it over and over. Again, late at night, double-checking every possible cost, every repair estimate, every worst-case scenario. Still, knowing and doing are two different things. When the starting bid was announced, it was lower than I expected, just under the amount I had saved. For a moment, no one said anything. Then someone in the front row raised their hand and placed the first bid. The number went up. Then another person joined. Then another. It was happening exactly the way Mr. Lawson said it would. People who understood value before everyone else. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear the numbers being called. I told myself I would wait. That I would only step in if it made sense. But as the bids slowed, as the increments became smaller, I realized something important. Most people in that room were not chasing this property. They were evaluating it, testing it, and then stepping back when it no longer fit their criteria. That meant there was a window, a narrow one but real. When the bidding paused for a fraction of a second, I raised my hand. My voice did not shake as much as I thought it would when I said the number. For a brief moment the room went still. A few people turned to look at me, not with surprise, but with quiet calculation, like they were reassessing the situation. One man in the front leaned forward, considering whether to continue. Then he sat back. No one else spoke. The auctioneer looked around the room, waiting for another bid. None came. He called the number once, then again. And then with a final strike of the gavel, it was over. Just like that. I had done it. I had committed to something bigger than anything I had ever attempted before. The paperwork that followed felt almost surreal. Signing documents, confirming payment terms, hearing my name attached to something other than a job application or a bill. It did not feel like a victory yet. Felt like responsibility. When I walked out of that building, the air felt different, not lighter but sharper, like everything had more weight to it now. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine, staring at the copy of the agreement in my hands, reading my name again and again, to make sure it was real. I had just bought a property. A small one. A neglected one. But it was mine. And for the first time since I was 18, I was not just surviving the consequences of someone else's decision. I was creating my own. But what I did not realize then was that this first purchase was not just a single step forward. It was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat itself in ways I could not yet see. I did not celebrate the purchase, not the way most people would expect. There was no dinner, no call to anyone, no moment where I allowed myself to feel like I had won something, because the moment I signed those papers, I understood something very clearly. This was where the real work started. The building did not magically become valuable just because I owned it. It was still the same neglected structure with peeling paint, outdated wiring, and a reputation that made most people walk past it without a second glance. The difference now was that every problem attached to that property belonged to me. The next morning, before my shift at the diner, I stood outside the building with a set of keys that felt heavier than they should have, staring at the door for a few seconds longer than necessary before unlocking it. The inside was worse than I remembered. Dust layered every surface, the air felt stale, and the space itself looked smaller now that I knew it was mine. I walked through each room slowly, not as someone passing by, but as someone responsible. Every crack in the wall, every broken fixture, every outdated system was no longer something to ignore. It was something to fix, calculate, or plan around. I pulled out my notebook and started writing everything down. Repair costs, cleaning needs, potential layouts. I did not have the money to fix everything at once, so I had to prioritize. Essentials first. Electrical, basic plumbing, safety, the kind of things no one notices when they work, but everyone notices when they do not. I spent my mornings working at the diner, my afternoons at the laundromat, my nights at the pharmacy, and whatever hours were left inside that building, cleaning, measuring, learning. I watched tutorials online during breaks, asked questions when I did not understand something, and made mistakes I could not afford to repeat. It was exhausting in a way I had never experienced before, not just physically but mentally, because every decision had consequences now, real ones tied to money I did not have room to waste. There were moments when I questioned everything. Standing alone in that empty space, covered in dust, running numbers that barely worked, I wondered if I had made a mistake stepping into something this big. But then I would remember something Mr. Lawson said, not in a lecture, not as advice, but casually, like it was obvious. Most people quit at the part where things stop being easy. So I did not quit. Instead, I adjusted. I started small. One room at a time. One system at a time. I found ways to cut costs, buying materials secondhand when possible, negotiating prices, doing as much of the work myself as I could. It was not fast. It was not perfect. But it was progress. And slowly that space began to change. Not dramatically, not overnight, but enough that I could see what it could become instead of just what it had been. The first time I stood in that building and did not see a problem but a possibility, something shifted again. Because it was no longer just about fixing what was broken. It was about creating something that worked. And what I did not realize then was that this process, this cycle of finding overlooked value, improving it, and turning it into something functional, was something I would repeat again and again in ways that would eventually reach far beyond that single building. The first time someone paid me for that space, it did not feel like success, it felt like relief, like proof that all the hours, all the calculations, and all the quiet decisions had actually led to something real. It was a small agreement, nothing complicated, just a local vendor who needed a place to store equipment and operate a few days a week. But when he handed me that first check, I noticed something immediately. It was not tied to an hourly shift, it was not tied to how many hours I worked that day, it existed because of something I owned. I went back to my car after that meeting and sat there for a few minutes, holding the check in my hand, reading the amount over and over again, not because it was large, but because it represented something completely different from everything I had known before. It was the first time money came to me without me trading my time directly for it. That realization stayed with me. I deposited the check that same afternoon and updated my notebook that night, adding a new column I had never needed before: income from assets. It looked small on paper, almost insignificant compared to the hours I was still working, but I understood what it meant. It was the beginning of a shift. Over the next few months, I focused on stabilizing that space, making it consistent, making it reliable, making it something people could depend on. I fixed what I could, improved what I understood, and learned the rest as I went. I made mistakes, small ones and expensive ones, but I tracked every single one so I would not repeat them. Slowly, the space began to hold its own. It was not just surviving, it was producing. That was when I went back to the county listings. Not casually this time, not just observing, but actively searching. I knew what to look for now. Properties that had been overlooked. Buildings that had problems other people did not want to deal with. Numbers that did not look attractive at first glance but made sense when you understood how to improve them. I was not guessing anymore. I was evaluating. The second property I considered was smaller than the first, but it had something I had not fully appreciated before: location. It sat on a quiet street with consistent foot traffic, not busy enough to be expensive, but active enough to support something functional. The numbers were tight. Tighter than the first deal. But I understood risk better now. I understood how to measure it, how to prepare for it, how to adjust when things did not go exactly as planned. When I brought it up to Mr. Lawson, he did not tell me what to do. He never did. He just asked questions. What is the downside? What is the worst case? Can you survive it? I answered each one carefully, going through my notes, my projections, my savings. When I finished, he nodded once, the same way he had at the beginning. Then you already know, he said. So I moved forward. Not impulsively, not emotionally, but deliberately. Step by step. The second purchase was not as overwhelming as the first. It was still stressful, still uncertain, but I recognized the process now. I knew where the risks were. I knew how to prepare. And more importantly, I trusted my ability to figure things out if something went wrong. That confidence was new. It was not loud or obvious, but it was there, steady and growing. And as I stood outside that second property, keys in hand, I realized something that would shape everything that came after. This was not luck. This was not a one-time event. This was a system. Find overlooked value. Improve it. Let it produce. Repeat. But what I did not realize then was how far that system would take me, and how one day it would bring me back to a place I never thought I would see again. By the time I closed on the second property, I had already started thinking differently about everything around me, not just buildings but patterns, people, even time itself, because I was no longer measuring progress in days or shifts. I was measuring it in systems that could grow without me standing there every hour. The second property took less time to stabilize than the first, not because it was easier, but because I had already made most of the mistakes I needed to make. I knew where costs could spiral if I ignored them. I knew how long repairs actually took instead of how long I hoped they would take. I knew how to run numbers without guessing. And most importantly, I knew how to be patient. That changed everything. Instead of rushing to fill the space, I waited for the right opportunity, the right tenant, the right use. It took longer than I wanted, but when it happened, it made sense. The income was steady, predictable, and for the first time I saw something else clearly. The combined income from both properties was starting to cover more than just expenses. It was creating room. Room to think. Room to plan. Room to move. That was when I made a decision that would have scared me. A year earlier, I reduced my hours at the diner. Not completely, not yet, but enough to free up time during the day. It felt risky. It felt like stepping away from something certain into something uncertain. But I understood the trade. Time was now more valuable than hourly pay. Time was what allowed me to find the next opportunity. I still worked at the pharmacy at night, still kept my routine tight, still tracked every dollar, but my focus had shifted. I was no longer just maintaining what I had built. I was looking for what came next. That search brought me back to places I had not thought about in years. Old neighborhoods. Familiar streets. Areas that had once been part of my life before everything changed. First, it was just curiosity. I would drive through on my way between properties, noticing what had changed and what had not. Some areas had improved. Others had declined. But one street, one specific block, caught my attention in a way I could not ignore. It looked almost exactly the same as I remembered. Same houses. Same layout. Same quiet feel. But the details were different. Several homes had deferred maintenance. A few had for sale signs that had clearly been there too long. One had a notice posted on the door. It was not obvious to most people. To someone just passing through, it would look like any other neighborhood. But to me, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like opportunity. I parked a few streets away and walked through it slowly, not as someone revisiting the past, but as someone evaluating the present. I took mental notes the way I always did. Condition, ownership patterns, signs of financial pressure, potential entry points. It was not emotional. It was analytical. But there was something else there too, something I did not fully acknowledge at the time. Recognition. Because this was not just any street. It was the one I grew up on. The same place I had walked away from 10 years earlier with a single suitcase. The same place where I had learned what it felt like to be invisible. I stood at the corner for a moment longer than necessary, looking down the block without letting myself focus on any one house in particular. Not yet, because I understood something important. This was not about going back. This was about moving forward with everything I had learned. And what I did not realize then was that this street, this familiar place that had once pushed me out, was about to become the center of everything I had been building toward. The first property on that street did not come to me through luck. It came through patience, the kind of patience I did not have 10 years ago, the kind I had learned one long shift at a time, one careful decision after another. I did not rush in just because it was familiar. I did not let memory cloud what the numbers were telling me. Instead, I treated it like every other opportunity one had evaluated. I pulled public records. I checked ownership history. I looked at how long the property had been listed and how many times the price had been reduced. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. The owner needed to sell more than they wanted to. That was the opening. I reached out through the listing agent, not as Emily Carter, not as someone returning, but through a small company name I had registered months earlier. It was something Mr. Lawson had suggested once casually when we were talking about structure. Keep business separate from identity, he said. It gives you options. At the time, I did not fully understand what he meant. Now I did. The negotiation was slow, deliberate, and quiet. There were no emotional conversations, no personal history, just numbers, timelines, and conditions. I made an offer that reflected the actual state of the property, not the version someone hoped it could be. They countered. I adjusted. Back and forth, each step calculated, each decision grounded in what I had learned. In the end, we reached a number that worked not perfectly but realistically. When I signed the agreement, it did not feel like coming home. It felt like executing a plan. The day I got the keys, I did not walk through the front door immediately. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at the house from a distance, noticing details I had ignored growing up. The slight tilt in the porch railing, the uneven paint along the siding, the way the driveway had cracked over time. These were not memories anymore. They were data points. I walked inside with the same mindset I had developed from the first two properties. Assess, prioritize, plan. It needed work. More than I had hoped, less than I had feared. I wrote everything down. Estimated costs, timeline, potential return. Nothing emotional, nothing personal, just numbers. But there was one difference this time. Location. This was not just another property. This was part of a system I had already started to recognize. A cluster of homes with similar issues, similar ownership patterns, Similar signs of pressure. One property alone was a project. Multiple properties in the same area could become something else entirely. That realization stayed with me as I worked through the first repairs. I was not just fixing a house. I was testing a model in a specific location. Over the next few weeks, I monitored everything. Response from potential renters. Maintenance costs. Neighborhood activity. I paid attention to who came and went, which houses looked stable and which ones showed signs of decline. Patterns started to emerge, the same way they had at the laundromat, the same way they had with my first property. And once I saw the pattern, I could not unsee it. This street was not just familiar. It was predictable. And predictability meant opportunity. I went back to my notebook and started mapping everything out. Every house. Every owner I could identify. Every sign that suggested future movement. It was not fast work. It required time, research, and restraint. But it was clear. Piece by piece, I began to see how it could come together. Not overnight. Not all at once. But step by step. Property by property. And what I did not realize then was that this careful, quiet approach, this decision to move strategically instead of emotionally, was about to lead me directly to the one house I had been avoiding since the moment I stepped back onto that street. For a long time, I avoided looking directly at that house, not because I was afraid of it, but because I understood something about timing that I had learned the hard way. Some things are not about whether you can act, they are about when you should. I had already mapped most of the street by then. Every property I could access through public records, every ownership timeline, every sign of financial pressure or stability. And when I finally allowed myself to look at that specific address, I did not see it the way I used to. I did not see birthday dinners or arguments or the night everything ended. I saw a property with a long ownership history, no recent refinancing, and subtle indicators that things had not been as stable as they once appeared. The lawn maintenance had declined. The exterior paint had not been updated in years. Small things, the kind most people would ignore, but they told a story. I did not reach out immediately. Instead, I watched. Weeks turned into months, and during that time, I continued working on the other properties on the street, quietly building position without drawing attention. One house became two. Two became three. Each one acquired through the same process. Research, patience, negotiation, execution. Always under the company name, never personal, never emotional. By the time I returned my focus to that house, the situation had changed. There was a listing. It was not prominent, not heavily marketed, but it was there. I pulled the details the same way I always did. Listing price, time on market, previous adjustments. And then I saw something that confirmed what I had been waiting for. A price reduction that suggested urgency, not strategy. That was the signal. I contacted the agent through the same company channel I had used before, keeping everything consistent, professional, and distant. The conversation was different this time. Not hostile, not difficult, but strained in a way that suggested the sellers needed a resolution more than they wanted control. I did not ask who they were. I did not need to. The address was enough. The numbers were enough. I made an offer based on reality, not sentiment. It was not aggressive, but it was firm. The kind of offer that solves a problem quickly. There was a delay before the response came back, longer than usual, as if the decision required more discussion than most. When it did come, it was a counter higher than I expected, but still within a range that made sense. I adjusted slightly, not enough to change the structure of the deal, just enough to move it forward. Then I waited. That part never got easier. Waiting for someone else to decide whether your plan moves forward or stops completely. But I trusted the process. I trusted the numbers. Days passed. Then a week. And then the message came through. Accepted. The word sat on the screen longer than it should have, not because I was surprised, but because I understood exactly what it meant. Not just another acquisition. Not just another step in the system. Something else. Something that connected everything that had come before it. The closing process was standard. Paperwork. Verification. Signatures. Nothing emotional. Nothing dramatic. Just a sequence of steps leading to a final transfer of ownership. But there was a moment, a small one, when I saw the full address printed next to the company name I controlled, and something shifted, not in the way I expected. There was no anger. No satisfaction. Just clarity. Because this was no longer about proving anything to anyone. It was about what I had built. And what I did not realize then was that the moment those papers were finalized, the structure I had been building quietly piece by piece had reached a point where it would no longer stay invisible. The closing did not change anything on the surface, at least not immediately. The street still looked the same, the houses still stood in their familiar places, and to anyone passing by, nothing about it suggested that ownership had quietly shifted beneath it, but I knew something had changed because now the structure was complete. Over the next few weeks, I moved through the process the same way I always had, methodically, without drawing attention, reviewing each property I controlled on that block, aligning maintenance, standardizing agreements, and tightening the system so that everything operated with the same consistency I had built from the beginning. It was not about appearance. It was about control. Control over costs, over timelines, over outcomes. The more consistent the system became, the less it depended on constant oversight. That was the goal. Not just ownership, but stability. There was a moment, standing at the edge of the street one early morning before most people were awake, when I finally allowed myself to look at it as a whole, not as individual projects, not as separate transactions, but as a single unit. House after house, each one connected not by memory, but by structure. It was quiet, almost still, but underneath that stillness was something entirely different. A network of decisions, of risks taken and managed, of patterns recognized and acted on. I thought about the version of myself who had left this place with one suitcase and no plan, and for a brief second, the contrast was almost difficult to process. Not because I felt emotional about it, but because the difference was so complete. Back then, everything had been decided for me. Where I could go. What I had access to. What I was allowed to be. Now, every part of this system existed because of choices I had made, one after another, without permission, without approval, without anyone guiding the outcome except me. That realization did not come with a sense of victory. It came with clarity. Because this was never about returning. It was never about reclaiming something that had been taken. It was about building something that could not be taken in the first place. A few days later, I received a message forwarded through the property management contact I had set up months earlier. A request. Not formal, not aggressive, but uncertain. The tone was different from anything I had seen before, careful, almost hesitant. It was from the occupants of one of the houses on the street, asking about lease terms, about possible extensions, about flexibility. The name attached to the request was familiar, even without seeing it directly. I did not respond immediately. I reviewed the agreement first. Terms, conditions, payment history. Everything was handled the same way it would be for any other property. No exceptions. No emotional adjustments. Just the system I had built. But as I looked at the details, I understood something that had been building quietly in the background. This was the point where everything intersected. Not through confrontation. Not through dramatic reveal. But through structure. Because now, every decision they made about staying, leaving, negotiating, or continuing ran through something I controlled. And what I did not realize then was that the next interaction on that street would not be about the past at all. It would be about the reality of the position I had built, and how impossible it would be for anyone to ignore it any longer. The message came through early in the morning, routed through the property management system like every other request, formatted the same way, structured the same way, but there was something about it that felt different, not in the words themselves but in what they implied. A request for a meeting. Not a complaint. Not a negotiation through email. A meeting. In person. I read it twice, then once more, not because I did not understand it, but because I recognized what it represented. This was not about lease terms anymore. This was about recognition. I responded the same way I would to any other tenant request, professional, neutral, confirming a time and location. No indication that I knew anything beyond what was written in the system. The meeting was scheduled for that afternoon at one of the properties on the edge of the block. A neutral location. Not tied to any single address too directly. I arrived early, as I always did, walking through the space once before settling near the front window where I could see the street clearly. It looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Quiet. Familiar. Unchanged on the surface. A few minutes later, a car pulled up and parked along the curb. I recognized it immediately, not because of the model or the color, but because of something deeper, something tied to memory, even though I had spent years training myself not to rely on it. The door opened. My father stepped out first, slower than I remembered, his posture slightly different, like time had shifted something he could not control. My mother followed, her movements more cautious, her expression tighter than I had ever seen it. And then Sophia, still composed, still controlled, but not as certain as she used to be. They stood there for a moment, looking at the building, at the street, at everything around them, as if trying to understand something that no longer made sense. Then they walked toward the door. I did not move. I did not step forward. I waited. When they entered, there was a brief pause, the kind that happens when expectation collides with reality, and neither side has adjusted yet. My father looked at me first, then again, as if his mind needed a second to process what his eyes were seeing. No one spoke immediately. The silence stretched just long enough to make it clear that this was not a misunderstanding. This was not a coincidence. This was structure. I broke the silence the same way I would in any meeting. Calm. Direct. You requested a meeting regarding your lease. My voice did not change. It did not carry anything from the past. It was simply the role I had built. My mother's hand tightened around her bag. Sophia glanced at my father, then back at me, searching for something that was no longer there. My father finally spoke, but the authority in his voice was gone, replaced by something uncertain, something that did not quite know where it stood anymore. Emily, he started, but the name felt different coming from him now, like it no longer held the same weight. I did not respond to it. Instead, I placed a folder on the table in front of me, the same type of folder I use for every property, every agreement, every decision. Inside were the documents, lease terms, ownership records, structured, organized, complete. If you have questions, I said, we can go through them. That was it. No confrontation. No explanation. No need to revisit anything that had already been decided 10 years ago. Because everything that needed to be understood was already in front of them. Not in words, but in reality. They looked at the documents, at the company name, at the signatures, at the structure that connected everything on that street. And in that moment I saw it clearly. Not shock. Not regret. Recognition. Because this was no longer about what they had said to me, or what I had lost. It was about what I had built. Quietly. Consistently. Without them. And what they did not know was that the sentence that once defined my life, the one that sent me away with nothing, had become the foundation of everything they were now standing inside.